All right, everyone. Well, we're still seeing those numbers tick up. I know it always takes a few minutes for folks to join, but we're going to go ahead and get started as you all are continuing to jump in. And just want to first of all say good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session, Beyond the Binary, Celebrating International Non-Binary Peoples Day. We are certainly thrilled to have all of you here. We have a great session and discussion planned for you all. And from our heart to yours, happy International Non-Binary Day. We are so excited to celebrate the non-binary community, and I'm particularly excited to celebrate being a member of the community. And I know we have a number of folks here as well who are also excited to celebrate. We have a great panel of folks to talk and share more about non-binary experiences, non-binary identity in the workplace, and what companies and individuals can do together to be better allies. So with that, we can go on to the next slide. I just want to give a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is a Zoom virtual learning session from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific time. Please use your speakers or headsets on your computer. Turn the volume up to ensure you are getting clarity throughout our call today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit those through the question and answers box, or you could submit through our chat function. Our staff are monitoring that, and we will have some time at the end to answer your questions. Just a note, today's call will be recorded, and we will follow up with that recording, as well as the slide deck for you to share with colleagues who were unable to make it today. So we're excited to get started, and I just want to quickly share our panel here in the next slide. As I mentioned, we have a great panel of speakers lined up for an excellent discussion today. Just to introduce myself, I am Madeline Jelpe. I'm the Senior Manager of Stakeholder Engagement here at Out and Equal. Pronouns, anything respectful is fine with me. I wear a lot of hats in the organization, but I am really happy to have been part of the creation of some of our resources around non-binary inclusion, particularly our latest resource, What's Your Pronouns? Strategies for Inclusion in the Workplace, and also our best practices for non-binary inclusion. So I'm going to be bringing some of that knowledge to today's call as we dive into the content. And I am joined today by my colleague, Stevie Viverito, Associate Director of Global Initiatives at Out and Equal, AC Doomlau, Program Manager at Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Kathy Martinez, Director of Labor Relations for the Southeast Division at Walmart. And I'm going to do a more thorough introduction of my fellow panelists here in just a moment, but just first of all, wanted to say up front how grateful and excited we all are to have such a wonderful group on today's call. Before we get started with that discussion, we first wanted to offer some initial guidance and education on what we mean when we are talking about non-binary. And we can jump into that next slide. Today, as you all know, is International Non-Binary Peoples Day. And this day is observed each year on July 14th. And it's truly an important day for visibility, awareness of, education, and celebration of the non-binary community. And there's still, as we'll talk about on the call, there's a lot of work to be done for non-binary inclusion, especially in terms of elevated visibility, awareness, education. But this day and the conversations around it really help to do that. They help to articulate these important truths, these identities, and experiences had by people across the world. And so just to touch on a personal story around this, for me, learning about what non-binary means and the word itself, helped me to better internally articulate who I am and my lived truth every day. And, I think sometimes it's easy to underestimate the power that words have in learning about new identities and how those can shape us and who we are, and how we are able to understand, you know, who we are and where we're situated in the world. So, you know, I think it's just truly beautiful how these words can create space in our minds, new roads and ways of thinking to get to know those deeper parts of who we are, which is why non-binary visibility is so important. You know, before I knew what non-binary identity was, I just always assumed that I had to identify as one or the other. That, you know, I had to be something that didn't really feel right to me. And so I am so happy and excited to be here on this webinar with all of you and have these discussions to raise visibility around this important identity and have some discussions on how to make the world a better place and our workplaces a better place for the non-binary community. So before we jump into our discussion with our panelists today, I do want to provide some initial framework for how to think about and understand what we mean when we're talking about non-binary identity. So let's jump into the next slide. And first we need to look at, you know, the differences between sex and gender. Typically the terms sex and gender are incorrectly used in place of one another, though the definitions are actually quite different. When we're talking about sex assigned at birth, we're talking about a label, male or female, that you are assigned by a doctor at birth based on genitals that you're born with and the chromosomes that you have. And so that goes on a birth certificate, and it's decided for you as a baby by a doctor. But gender is something that is a bit more nuanced and complex, as we'll talk about. And we have to think of it as a social construction. It's something that we invented in society that's not necessarily set in stone. You know, it's these expectations, these behaviors or characteristics or thoughts that we quote unquote should have that are sort of assigned to one's sex assigned at birth. The meaning of gender changes from culture to culture, and that's how we know it's socially constructed. Each culture kind of has their own standards about the way that people should behave based on gender. But instead of, you know, being about body parts, it's more about how you're expected to act because of your sex. And I want to note, you know, we're not saying biological sex here. Instead of saying biological sex, some people use the phrase assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. And this acknowledges that someone, often a doctor, is making a decision for someone else. Most people are assigned male or female, and that's what, again, is put on your birth certificate. However, there are babies that are born intersex, which is an umbrella term for differences in sex traits or reproductive anatomy. And intersex people are born with many possible differences in genitalia, hormones, internal anatomy, or chromosomes compared to the usual two ways that human bodies develop. This is common and unfortunately often mislabeled on birth certificates. And I bring that up to just note that, you know, having only two options, biological female or male, does not fully capture the complex biological, anatomical, or chromosomal variations that can occur. So the binary is limiting here as well. And then going into the next slide, you know, gender identity, this is how you feel inside. It's core to who you are. It's a feeling that can begin very early on in life, and it can be sometimes suppressed by societal pressures. And, you know, gender identity is deeply personal. It's that internal sense of who we are and how you move about in the world. Now, gender expression is something different. Gender expression is the ways in which a person expresses their gender identity, typically through appearance, behaviors, dress, and it's kind of, like I said, how we perform, how we do gender. or express it externally. And it's important to note that gender identity and expression are not intrinsically linked. For example, man does not always equal masculine, woman does not always equal feminine. A good example is, a cisgender woman can have a masculine expression that in no way changes her identity, her gender identity as a woman, etc. Now, I just mentioned a word that maybe some of you on the call are familiar with and others aren't, cisgender. So the term cisgender refers to a person whose gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth. So for example, if you were assigned female at birth and your gender identity is female, you would be considered cisgender. And perhaps some of you on the call might be thinking, as we've been sort of touching on these concepts, my gender identity isn't really that core to my identity. I've never really even thought about the fact that I identify as a man or a woman. Maybe some of you on the call are feeling that way. And I just want to call attention to how, that is an expression of privilege in terms of your cisgender identity. And it's also similar to, how white people don't necessarily think about being white every day, or if you're able-bodied, not something that you think about or that might be core to your identity because it has not presented struggles in your life. You didn't come out as cisgender, but trans identifying folks do. So of course, it's something that, is felt a lot more often because it's challenged a lot more. So just calling attention to that as we go in this discussion. And then the next slide, what does it mean in talking about non-binary identity? Where is this sort of situated in relation to other identity? So transgender people are those whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. And as you can see, there's a number of identities that fall under the transgender umbrella. And when we think of the umbrella, we tend to think of binary transgender identities. Binary transgender identities are those that fall along the binary of male and female. So for instance, we may think of a person who is assigned female at birth, but identifies as male and vice versa. Other folks identify as neither male or female, both male and female, or somewhere in between male or female, or altogether sort of off the binary in general. And so many people use the word non-binary to describe this identity. And we can go to the next slide. Some people don't fit neatly into the categories of male and female. Non-binary identity is a gender identity that falls outside of the gender binary, meaning an individual does not identify as strictly male or female. A non-binary person can identify as both or neither male or female, sometimes one or the other. And, you might see a few other terms used to describe gender identities outside of male and female, such as gender queer, gender fluid, agender, and bigender. These terms all have slightly different meanings, but they refer to an experience outside of the binary. So while the term non-binary falls under the umbrella of transgender identity, it's important to note that, identifying as transgender does not mean that a particular person identifies as non-binary, and not all non-binary people identify as transgender. So it's key to kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about this. Many non-binary folks use a different name from their given name. Some may undergo surgery to more closely align their bodies with their gender identity. Many, but not all, non-binary folks use gender-neutral pronouns to identify themselves. But I think that it's also important that, there are many different ways that people express their non-binary identity. There are many different ways to be non-binary, and all of those experiences are valid and important and true. So as we go through this, recognize that there's sort of a spectrum and a way to be in all of this. So I just shared a lot of information with you, and going into the next slide, there's certainly a lot more to cover here. As I've just touched base on the basics, but I want to give us a bit of fundamental understanding of the concepts to root ourselves in this discussion and go deeper with our wonderful panelists here. So if we can go to the next slide, Karina, and just one more. Thank you. On today's call, we have 3 leaders in the field of non-binary inclusion. First is our very own CV Viverito, Associate Director of Global Initiatives, where they manage the programs aimed at advancing LGBTQ workplace inclusion in Brazil and Latin America, China, and India. Through partnerships with NGOs and multinational and national corporations, they play a key role in the development and implementation of the organization's global strategy and activities. Drawing from a variety of sources, local experts and stakeholders, they oversee the curation of Out and Equal's globally focused content. They have previous experience working with NGOs in the Balkans, India, Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America to organize political leadership trainings for LGBTQ leaders, research, civil society forums, and regional conferences. And with over 10 years of experience working to advance LGBTQ equality, both in the US and around the world, they are passionate about creating change through an intersectional community-driven framework. They also speak English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So welcome, CV, to our call. Next up, we have AC Dumlao. AC Dumlao is a transgender, non-binary, first-generation Filipino-American activist. As program manager at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TLDEF, they manage the Name Change Project, which connects trans and non-binary people with lawyers, providing pro bono representation during the legal name change process. Additionally, AC leads TLDEF community education initiatives and is the lead trainer for transcultural competency presentations and workshops. In 2019, AC was named a New York City World Pride Communities Hero by Heritage of Pride during the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. AC's non-binary advocacy work and words have been featured by ABC News, NBC, The Huffington Post, Business Insider, Vice Media, and more. And they are a lifelong New Yorker, currently residing in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. So welcome to the call, AC. We're glad to have you here. And then last we have Kathy Martinez. As the Labor Relations Director at Walmart, Kathy has more than 15 years experience in human resources and employee relations, managing and supporting functional areas. Kathy currently serves as a leader supporting the labor relations functions for 6 regions across 6 states in the southeast area of the US, where she provides guidance on workplace matters. Kathy is currently serving as a part of Walmart's Pride ARG leadership team and leads field strategy for the US segment of the organization, which supports approximately 1.3 million associates. In this role, she's able to put on display her commitment to fostering inclusive workplaces, as well as having the opportunity to educate field leaders and associates on LGBTQ issues. Most recently, Kathy is extremely proud of her nomination and acceptance to become a member of PFLAG's National Board of Directors. She certainly considers her involvement with PFLAG a highlight in her professional and personal experience, and is extremely excited to learn and contribute to the amazing work PFLAG is already doing to enhance the lives of LGBTQ communities. Kathy, her 3 amazing daughters and wife reside in South Florida. So I just want to welcome all of you here to our call today, and you can all turn on your videos now. It's time to reveal yourself. And Karina, we can go ahead and turn off the, yes, the slides there. Wonderful. And first, I just really want to thank you all so much for being here today. You know, there's certainly a lot to talk about, and we are grateful for your expertise and leadership in this area. You know, in our conversation together, just for the audience, you know, we will go a little bit deeper into the concepts I touched on moments ago, and give the audience some concrete takeaways to utilize in demonstrating allyship, and doing so on a company and on an individual level. So, you know, before we get started talking a little bit more about what non-binary means, I want to talk about, you know, what it doesn't mean. What are some of the biggest misconceptions around being non-binary and gender non-conforming? And I'll pose that to you all as sort of the first question to open up our discussion today, and let you all jump in. What are some of those misconceptions?
I'm happy to get us started.
Awesome, Phoebe.
Sure. I think, so as you mentioned, Madeline, especially in the global work that Out and Equal does, but definitely also in the US and everywhere else, one misconception I'm hearing a lot is that it's something new, or that it's something that, you know, new generations are changing gender, and in a way, yes, they are. But what comes out of that conversation is, well, why do we have to change? This is confusing, or worse, it's not real. So one, even if these were new identities, that's a pretty terrible reason to not be accepting. But two, they're actually as old as human history, right? The problem is who our history has been written by, right? And so the lens that we're looking through when we read history books maybe is not so accurate, or it's one side of the story. So to go on a little historical journey here, even from 2000 to 1800 BCE, we see Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you can actually find 3 recorded genders. That's 2000, 1800 BCE. So you see men, women, and another gender. Common belief used to be, kind of still is sometimes, that this third gender were eunuchs. But some scholars are looking at this and saying, actually, we should re-examine, because that's a very binary interpretation of what was going on thousands and thousands of years ago. There very well may have been 3 recognized genders in this society. The third being some sort of, to use in the English term, non-binary identity. And moving past that into more well-recorded histories, we still see pre-colonial identities, so 13th, 14th, 15th century non-binary identities all over the world. There's literally too many examples to give on this call, so I encourage like a quick Google. It's really interesting. But to name a few, I mean, here in the US, we might be most familiar with the pan-native identity called Two-Spirit, which is an umbrella term coined by Indigenous peoples, actually meant to bridge Indigenous and Western understandings of sexuality and gender. So it's a pan-native term. It refers to people with mixed gender roles found among Indigenous North American cultures. But there's also the Mahu identity, was very prevalent in pre-colonial, what is now Hawaii and Tahiti. And they were also third gender persons, usually notable spiritual figures, healers, although much of this history was socially and culturally wiped out through the intervention of European missionaries. There's also, to give like 2 more quick examples, just to paint this picture for you, the Indonesian Bisu in what is now Indonesia. Back then, there were actually 5 recognized genders, and if we're speaking English, it would roughly translate to a cis man, cis woman, trans man, trans woman, and a non-binary person. And there was not really too many borders around these genders. They're fluid. Again, not only accepted members of society, but celebrated, often playing highly regarded spiritual roles in the culture. So also kind of wiped out by colonialism, but again, being reclaimed today. But even in Norway in 1781, there's this case of somebody named Jens Andersen who married a woman, and it was soon discovered that this person had, in quotes, a female body, and the marriage was annulled and they were sent to trial. And it's recorded in 1781 that in trial they asked, are you a man or a woman? And this person said that they think that they're both. So what happened? Unfortunately, the 15th and 19th century, Europeans colonized nearly all of the world. And at the time, much of Europe, as we see in the case of Jens Andersen in Norway, was very socially conservative, and queer identities were ostracized and punished. So unfortunately, right, colonization is not just geographic, it's also social and cultural. So it erased any aspect of these native cultures that went against the colonizers' norms. So we see these identities being so far pushed to the margins that they're effectively, at least socially, erased. So that goes to say, making my point, this isn't just a millennial or a Gen Z trend. This essentially is a queer decolonization movement at its heart. It aims to deconstruct these colonial and patriarchal gender norms and embrace identities that have always existed outside the binary, and to then give space to us to explore them. And in order to do that, activists around the world are reworking their language, and this looks different in every language, but to name the identities and to find pronouns that we're comfortable using. So when you think about it this way, it's, you know, it's a really beautiful thing. And that kind of dispels one of the things to your question, Madeline, of the biggest misconception is that it's something new. It's something very, very old.
Yeah, Stevie, thank you for that. It's so illuminating to think of the movement in that way, as sort of reclaiming space and identity. And you know, I think it's easy for people who don't have that history to think, you know, well, Merriam-Webster just chose the pronoun they as their word of the year in 2019 because searches were rising for the term by 313%. Like, what's happening? This new identity is taking over our conversations and our LGBTQ initiatives. It's something that people are just kind of jumping into now, but I think that context, it just demonstrates how that's not the case at all. Yeah, thank you for that. Anything else, misconceptions around non-binary identity? I know CV covered a lot.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I may, I'm kind of bringing it back to the workplace, right? I think quite often non-binary individuals are dismissed by those typically, right, that don't understand, don't have history, don't have the knowledge. And in the work that I've done, right, with Walmart around LGBTQ issues, I have had the opportunity to interact with some amazing non-binary individuals who have struggled, right, to be recognized simply because they don't fit the gender norms that have been, imposed on us. And there is unfortunately a misconception that being non-binary is a fad, and I know that alludes a little bit to what CV covered, or that it's going to pass, right? This is something temporary, and it's going to go away. And some even say that many non-binary individuals are confused. And again, I have found that in most cases it's because we don't take the time to educate ourselves. So thank you, CV, for sharing that background. And unfortunately, and I think we all know this, these assumptions have resulted in isolation, or division for non-binary individuals.
Thank you for that. AC, were you going to jump in as well?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think bridging between what CV and Kathy shared is exactly what you were saying during your overview, Madeline, that there's gender expression and gender identity, while being aligned for many people, one does not necessarily inform the other. And as non-binary identity becomes more well-known in the mass media, people like singer-songwriter Sam Smith, people like Asia Kate Dillon on the scripted TV show Billions, these are conventionally attractive, thin, white people who look androgynous towards more masculine. And while someone can look androgynous and not necessarily be in the masculine or feminine appearance category, regardless of how you look on that scale. There's no one way to look non-binary. And so, you know, very quickly on my coming out as a non-binary person, for a long time, I didn't even think of the possibility of identifying that way because I did not see anyone who looked like me, a brown-skinned Asian person who is not a skinny model or someone like that. And it's been really important to say that even if someone is very feminine, like the actress India Moore, who's a non-binary person who plays a trans woman on the show Pose, or someone very masculine like the deaf activist and actor Chalaman, who does use he, him pronouns, but is a genderqueer person and not a man, that appearance does not automatically equal gender. And it's really important to take a step back and undo those assumptions of automatically gendering a person as soon as you see them. And when that gets into the workplace and HR context, that can become muddy, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't interrogate it and look at the systems that we have in order to be more inclusive.
Thank you for that. Yeah, great answers, and appreciate all of your insights here. And going into the next question, I think, you know, transitioning into the workplace and talking about where non-binary identities are situated, you know, what are some of the common obstacles that non-binary employees do face in the workplace today? What are some of the things that the community is up against? And we could expand to look at, you know, outside of the workplace as well.
I will start with this one if you want me to. So I believe that the most common obstacles faced by non-binary individuals in the workplace today is exclusion. And I say this just because of just, you know, interacting with so many associates in Walmart. And for us, it's so important to get feedback, right, as we kind of move through this inclusion journey. Some examples include that I could share with you based on the feedback is being ignored, being misgendered it's a big one. Not being called by the proper name or pronoun. We just discussed this and you know, a second ago, right? And in some instances, even being harassed by fellow coworkers. The reality is that we want to create an inclusive workspaces for all of our employees. And it is imperative that we create awareness by educating employees and leaders, and, you know, in organizations, all organizations. I know for us, being so large, it's really, really important. We touch so many individuals on a daily basis that we educate leaders. I think there must be a clear understanding that in order to support our non-binary employees, we must go beyond the typical LGBTQ education, similar to what you did today, Madeline. I think that there has to be specific education around the needs of our non-binary employees. And that's why we must be more intentional to you know, to provide that education around those specific needs.
Great, thank you, Kathy. AC, yeah, I see you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that Kathy said. And, you know, my first foray into any kind of discussions of best practices in the workplace was for me to be a person coming out as non-binary myself at a former advertising firm that I worked at. And to be the only person who identified as non-binary or who was out in that way, and to try to make little pushes, such as asking whether we could incorporate pronouns into our signatures, which, you know, took a long time through kind of the bureaucracy of that company, but eventually did become standardized across the company. And it was, it can be a scary thing when you are particularly in that case, I was a junior level person, a new person. I didn't necessarily have the internal connections or the cloud or, you know, the seniority, and I wasn't sure how it would be received. And luckily that was an environment where I was able to move those things forward. But it's really crucial for people who are in management positions, in HR and operations positions, to understand that, exactly as CV was saying, they said that, you know, none of this is new. It's important for companies to understand that it's not that we need to prepare in the future for if we have a non-binary employee, but rather to make sure that we've created the environment where a person can feel comfortable to explore their gender, to perhaps come out as transgender or non-binary, to be able to share personally, oh, my partner or my child is non-binary and I wasn't sure if I could speak about it until now. It's that kind of holistic look at not let's do it in reaction, but rather be as proactive as possible, even as we do have to navigate these very binary systems, such as with the EEO1 form, right, to report for gender equity. But there are still ways and internal systems that can provide a place to put someone's chosen name, to put the person's pronouns that they go by, even if things like legal name or assigned sex at birth is necessary for health insurance or for any kind of back-end reporting purposes, because that is where we have the power in our internal companies kind of systems to make those little changes that are actually big changes. You know, Madeline, you were saying that language matters, and it really, really does. And it takes all kinds of big and small changes to make sure that that comfort level is there for your employees.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. There are both big and small changes there that I think have incredibly big impacts on how people feel and are able to show up in the workplace as their authentic selves. And you know, we've touched on, you know, pronouns a bit, and I just want to go back to that question. You know, can you all speak to the importance of correct pronoun usage? Why is it critical that employers implement inclusive practices and strategies around pronouns?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way that we use language holds power. It has the power to offer acknowledgement, validation, respect, and it has the power to deny them. So inclusive language provides this framework of knowledge for us that informs the way that we conceptualize the world around us. So, for example, the very act of using gender neutral pronouns gives people a way of engaging in constructive dialogue, right? And then they build a positive understanding of trans and non-binary identities. So if you start calling your non-binary friend who uses they, them, you're more likely to see them not as a binary person. And so the very language can shape your understanding with practice. Mm-hmm. That's, you know, mm-hmm. it can be a really culture shifting tool to make room for everyone in our conversations, and also to center the language that is created for the community by the community. So it's one way to advance equality, but it's an important one. Language is forever evolving since the beginning of language. So we need to continue to expand it and involve it and make room for everybody to exist. And I think to put it in kind of like, to hold a mirror to it, it's as simple as like, would you use a cisgender person's pronouns incorrectly? You know, would you not care if you called a cisgender person by the wrong name all the time, had an email address with a different name than the one that they used, had names that on forms that are different than the one that they use? So these are basic facets of belonging, of feeling seen, respected, valued as a person, which of course greatly affects our mental and emotional health, as studies have shown.
Absolutely.
So I think pronouns and language have the power to do that in the workplace, and that's why it's so important.
Yeah. Thank you for that, CV. And we're actually getting, I see a question here, Madeline, why do you have anything respectful and not they, them? I think this is a new way of thinking for me, but do you identify as he, she, they? Yes. I think that for me, and this is a journey for me, to get to the place where I am, anything respectful for me encapsulates how I kind of feel all of the identities or gender identities at once, and or sometimes more male or more female on other days. There's sort of like I feel like the way I think about my identity is very nuanced, and I want to make it clear to people that I don't identify as cisgender. I'm okay with how people acknowledge me generally, and hey, that might change. It might be very well true that I don't like she, her anymore. And for me, like I actually hate when people call me lady, because that doesn't identify me correctly. I see myself as not that way. And so I think that I mentioned this before, that language has been so important to me, to understanding myself and knowing about who I can be, that's outside of what I've been told that I always should be or should ascribe to being. So yeah, I just wanted to answer that up front. I do get a lot of questions about it, because it's, you know, I guess not a lot of people do that, but that's what fits me. It's what makes the most sense. So I'll keep going. We have so many questions I want to ask to our panelists here, and I want to try to get to some of you all's questions as well. And I'll start by AC. I want to touch on some of your work at Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. You know, your work in non-binary inclusion has been incredibly influential and important for visibility and awareness. I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about your work with the Name Change Project, and adding to that, you know, what can employers do? You mentioned a few of these in just a moment ago, but what can employers do to better support initiatives like this, as well as ensure their policies and practices are inclusive of non-binary folks?
Absolutely. Thank you, Madeline. So I guess I'll start by saying, you know, for the 200 plus people on this call, if you are a cisgender person who continues to go by the name that you were given at birth, you probably take for granted how often you use that name when filling out forms, paperwork, applications, when we used to be outside pre-COVID, going to bars or concerts showing your ID, right? Our name is our marker. It's everywhere. And so for a transgender or non-binary person who has chosen a name different from the one that they were given as a child, having that mismatch between identification and the name that they've chosen and affirms them has very negative consequences internally for mental health, externally for safety, for being stopped by the police, for just simply experience misgendering on a constant level. And so our Name Change Project with TILDEF works not only with law firms, but also in-house counsel at corporations and businesses. So I will put a plug out. If any of your companies have in-house counsel that has the appetite for pro bono work, please definitely be in touch. But what we do is we pair participants, trans and non-binary participants who are low income, looking to update their name, and pair them with an attorney who is there to just help them navigate the system, which can be very confusing, can be full of legalese, It is intimidating to go to a courthouse. It is confusing to hunt down all of the correct paperwork, right? And so at the end of the day, it's creating this relationship that empowers the trans or non-binary individual to get this one aspect of the long list of things that they're navigating. Trans and non-binary people are disproportionately affected by houselessness and housing insecurity, food insecurity, economic insecurity, being unemployed, right? So an ID marker change is one thing off of this long list, and by providing this volunteer opportunity, we're able to help hundreds of people get their names changed every year. And as a non-binary person myself, and being with Tilda for almost 3 years, particularly as a non-binary person, seeing different states and cities move towards having an X or third gender, non-binary gender marker available for birth certificates and driver's licenses is an incredibly affirming thing. And so that is kind of my day-to-day work, which I'm very lucky to do. And beyond just government, federal and state IDs, our names appear so many places. Think of your first day at your job, how many forms you are filling out with your name. And when someone has the name mismatch, it can cause a lot of issues. People aren't sure if they should disclose it or not. They're not sure if this is a safe place to share who they are, right? So these are all things that I think companies need to proactively think through and understand that perhaps we do need to take down this person's old information on their current ID, but also have a place for their chosen name and their chosen pronouns. And you do have to report on the EEO-1 a person's binary female or male sex, but you can have the question say sex as required by the EEO-1, and then gender and fill in the blank, right? We have to break out of this idea that we have to follow these fill in the blank boxes the way they've always been, because like we've been saying, language changes over time, and therefore processes can change over time as well.
Thank you for that. That's really great insight. And I believe Madeline Perot is chatting out some links to AC's work, and I really encourage you all to get in touch with them and get involved in some of these important initiatives. Thank you for that. And I'm going to turn over to you now, Kathy, to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done at Walmart. You know, you've spearheaded some incredibly important initiatives to implement non-binary inclusion at Walmart. And I would love if you could tell us a little bit about that. What has Walmart done to promote non-binary inclusion in the workplace?
Thanks, Madeline. And you know, I will start by self-disclosing and just saying that we still have a lot of work to do. We like to remain very humble through this process, but our work towards non-binary inclusion started a few years back when we made the decision to expand on our core values. For those of you that are familiar with Walmart, we have some core values that we have carried out for over 50 years since you know, the inception of Walmart. We revised our key policies to be inclusive of gender identity and gender expression. And this really was great because it set a tone not only for our associates, but for our leaders, right? That we would not tolerate any type of discrimination, harassment, or mistreatment of anyone on basis of their gender identity, obviously to include your non-binary status. This included our open doors communications policy, which is huge in Walmart. It's like the cornerstone of our culture, which typically just affords associates at Walmart the opportunity to bring suggestions and concerns to any leader without fear of retaliation. Also, a few years ago, we implemented our workplace gender transition guidelines, and this was a huge step for us. Because these guidelines were designed to help support associates during a transition period in which they needed guidance or support in bringing their authentic selves to work. And to give you guys some examples, in these guidelines, we discuss creating safe workspaces for our associates during that coming out journey, for example. Something very simple, we use ID badges at Walmart. And it was so important for someone, right, who wanted to change their name on their badge that they used to come to work every day to the name that they identify with. So we included that in these guidelines. How do you change your name? And for some, for a while, it was like, oh, how many steps do we have to go through, when it was a very simple step. You just go and change the name. We talk about things like changing your name and your email. And obviously, as we have evolved in our systems in Walmart, we have been very thoughtful about having these options, right? So this simple stuff, as simple as it may sound to some of us, proved to be a big move in creating and fostering inclusive workspaces for our associates. I wanted to mention additionally, and I'm very, very excited about this. We just recently launched, and I know Madeline, you saw this. We recently launched a campaign that we call the #MyPronounsAre campaign. And this campaign is intended to provide education around the use of pronouns. I gotta tell you, me personally, it's been a huge learning opportunity for me. But the intent with this campaign, and what we're going to have in the campaign is a series of short videos that we are going to just explain and get more in depth as we go about the proper use of pronouns. We created, along with these videos, a lot of content for leaders and associates that they're able to dive into. And we created and made available to all associates in Walmart our pronoun pins. And I know that you guys can't see it because it's very far away, but the impact of the pronoun pins has been so great so far, because as minuscule as it may be, it just starts really great conversations amongst leaders and associates. And in addition, which is my favorite part, when you wear a pin, you're creating a safe space for an associate who may be struggling or may not feel comfortable to come out and just know that they could speak about their identity, and they could speak about what makes them feel comfortable at work. So I'll be sharing. I know that we're going to be sharing the video here in the chat function and after this session. But more than welcome to follow me on LinkedIn, and I'm sharing some of those videos there as well.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And I just want to acknowledge how great that pronoun pin initiative is, especially for a company like Walmart, where the number one largest private employer, I believe, in the world. I could be wrong about that, but just the impact that can have on the number of non-binary workers across the world, and seeing something like that and being included in that way. I'm mindful of time. I know that I am always tending to run over with these things, because I know we have so much wonderful stuff to talk about, but I want us to leave with some concrete ally tips to give to our audience here today. And there are a number of questions that we've gotten from the audience. I think that what we can do is address these perhaps in a follow-up email or blog post to ensure that folks get the answers they need. But I want to give you all the opportunity to maybe share some tips moving forward on how they can be better allies to the non-binary community. And AC, you wrote a wonderful article on this in Vice, I believe, last year. And so how about you kick us off, and then we can let others jump in.
Absolutely. It was actually 2 years ago, which seems, the way time moves is very, very wild these days. But, I think the biggest thing that I can share, and obviously it's related to non-binary identity and trans and non-binary inclusion, but as part of the greater conversation of being an ally, which is so at the top of mind with the Black Lives Matter movement, which directly intersects with the trans and non-binary movement. There is no LGBTQ pride movement as we know it without Black and brown, transgender, non-binary, queer people. So the biggest thing would be, it can feel scary to not know the definitions of all the vocabulary Madeline shared earlier. and being afraid of saying the wrong thing. But what we really need allies to do is to not be silent and to speak up if something feels wrong or sounds disrespectful. You know, I think it's a really beautiful learning opportunity, the interaction between Kathy and CV and people in the chat, and being able to say, yeah, pronouns, you know, it's something that we have to practice over and over again. But just because we don't know exactly what to say doesn't mean we should be silent, because being silent is choosing the side of hurting someone who's marginalized. So learning to do a good Google, like CV said earlier, learning to apologize gracefully, learning that when you learn new information, it's okay for your stance on something to change. And furthermore, really thinking about how holistically in your life you can incorporate trans and non-binary narratives, not only thinking about forms at your workplace, but thinking about the media that you consume, the authors that you read, the other social justice kind of themes and topics that you think about. So I think of reproductive health. There's a conversation about reproductive health that can be very exclusionary of transgender and non-binary people, especially those who are assigned female at birth but are not women, who do need access to different kinds of reproductive justice, right? So just really interrogating the way that we've learned about the world from pink and blue, boys and girls, men and women, and kind of just breaking out of that. I think that's an everyday kind of journey that we're each gonna have for the rest of our lives, even me, even CV, even Madeline, as people who do not identify as cisgender.
Thank you. I see those are great tips there, and really appreciate your insight. I'll let our other panelists jump in with any last tips for allyship for our audience.
I'll share something really short, and it's basically we are like holding our allies accountable. We are experiencing a lot of folks at Walmart that want to take responsibility and want to be supportive, and we're challenging them. We're telling them, okay, during a meeting, start by sharing your pronouns, for example. Just little things like that could really spark some great conversation. And for us, it's really important, since we're so large, to start creating these safe workspaces across the country, across the world, right? So changing your name on Zoom, like we've done here, you know, your pronoun on Zoom, like we've done here. We use, you know, a workplace. You know, there's so many ways to not only show that you're an ally, but then we commit those individuals to understanding that they have a responsibility to then have the knowledge and share that knowledge. So I think that that's a good challenge for all of our allies.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you.
Yeah.
CV?
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. I'll really quickly echo something that AC said, which is, I think, a big part of allyship in terms of non-binary inclusion would be to, you know, speak up but not over. Probably means listening more than you speak. So, you know, listen to trans and non-binary people's stories, but don't question them or compare them. You know, do your own education and learn more. And when I say speak up, not over, I guess what I mean is when you hear something discriminatory being said, or you hear someone who might mean well, but maybe made a false assumption or misinformed, that's the time that you do speak up as that ally in the room to help educate the rest of the people in the room. And it means so much coming from an ally. It really does. But don't speak over your trans and non-binary colleagues, like perhaps in a meeting. You know, amplify their voices in meetings, ask their opinions, call out the suggestions that they've made, recognize their contributions, give them credit, because oftentimes marginalized folks in a meeting, maybe they're not heard as much, or not asked to speak as much. So as an ally, and that goes across race, gender, sexuality, ability, all things, do that, like amplify those voices. That's a really important role to play as an ally, and make space for everyone at the table. If you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So let's try to get everybody to the table to be making those decisions and having those conversations.
Excellent. Thank you, CV, and thanks all of you for your incredible insight here. And just to sum it all up, this is we can always do better to our fellow human beings, and we should always utilize every opportunity and moment to do that together. I think that that's sort of the hopeful part of all of this, is that everything we do in diversity and inclusion work is about getting to a better space, to building a better world, building better relationships with the people around us, and like you all pointed out, holding people accountable to those values, and saying, hey, this is, you messed up, but we can continue to learn, and we can continue to do more together, and grow as a beautiful society of people. And so I thank you so much, all of you, for being here today, and wish we had all day to continue to chat with you all. We'll certainly follow up. There's a few questions here about, will this be shared? Yes, this will be on our website. We will also send out the slide deck and recording to all of our attendees here. And I do want to make sure we're able to get those questions answered that some of you have asked in the audience. So we'll provide that in a follow-up email as well. But so appreciate you all being here and your leadership, and happy International Non-Binary Day. What a great way to spend the day. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.